Concerning some last things of the book of Leviticus, after God's instruction in Exodus of the building of uh, the tabernacle is built, and then Moses does the dedication of it. There is, which we have read in the earlier chapters, all the instructions of the priests and what they are to sacrifice and how it's to be done and what they're to wear and all that. Then there is the dedication that Moses does of all the articles. And then there's the instructions of priests, but also the instructions of the people with regard to the priests and what the priests are doing, and instructions regarding to how the lay people take part with the priests in the offering of the sacrifices. Uh, of all the offerings being offered, there are offerings of thanksgiving and well-being. There's also what's called the sin offering, which might be better interpreted as the purification offering for sin. And that is that because of the people's sin, the sanctuary, the holy place, the dwelling place, the tabernacle of God is polluted by the people's sin. And the offering being made, blood of animals, and blood is where the life is and is given by God. You're not supposed to eat anything with the blood in it because the blood is God's gift. The blood being poured at the base of the altar and being dabbed on the horns of the altar purify God's dwelling place for the sins of the people. And the sacrifice, the animals being eaten, is table fellowship with the living God. Now, after all this is established, God gives particular commands as to how to treat one another, and also warnings about what not to take part in where they are going. What sins are the kinds of sins that will cut people off from fellowship with the living God and cut individuals off from the congregation of Israel, and thereby being cut off from the living God. But there is also the expectation that if you take part in these and confess them humbly and are contrite, not willing to take part again, then they're treated like a mistake, and you can therefore make the offering for purification and have table fellowship with the living God. And then the ending of Leviticus has to do with laws and to how to treat each other. And then particular celebratory festivals that are to be kept. And then the last part of Leviticus has to do with the blessings for obedience in keeping all these things that God has commanded, and then also what the punishment will be for disobedience. And even if they fall into the terrible disobedience and the kinds of things that the nations that God is going to displace and bring them in, even if they do that and they repent, they still can be blessed by the living God. So this is the ending of Leviticus, and we might bless the Lord that we're through it all. But read carefully and seeing what God is providing, it is really a blessing of being able to have fellowship with the living God. And the only things that can disrupt fellowship with the living God is the wrongful action of God's people. And even if you take part in the worst of those things, if you turn again, you can still have fellowship with the living God. And the last part, we see that the great warning that if you do not do these things, what will happen? And we'll find that, yes, Israel not only neglected, but took part in the evil, the horrible evil of the nations that they displaced, including the sacrifice of their children, the firstborn, being burned to Moloch. I think we ought to say a word about that pagan deity Moloch. It's one of the Baals, The name isn't really Moloch. Melech is the word for king. Baal is a word meaning the Lord. And this was apparently the chief of the Baals, Melech being king. But the vowels for Moloch is the word, the consonants are for Melech, but Moloch comes from a word meaning shame. And so the designation of Moloch is the shame of Israel, that they did fall into sacrificing their children. Even the kings of Israel in later times did this. And this was all part of a fertility cult. Isn't that strange? Sacrificing children as part of a fertility cult. It doesn't seem to make much sense. Although in our modern times, there has been the euphemisms used for abortion, calling it a woman's right to choose, nothing being said about the unborn and the harm being done there, no choice being given there. And then more recently, a woman's reproductive rights, whereas abortion doesn't reproduce anything. In fact, it's the very opposite. It's destruction. And all for rights and freedoms. And for how many years? 50 years? About 65 million children in the United States not being born, all in the name of fertility. It sounds strange, but we've seen this in the ancient world as well. But in all these things, if one is truly repentant, one can turn and still be brought into fellowship with the living God, and sins being remembered no more, as we have read in the prophets. Well, I hope these are help and blessing in interpreting Leviticus, and we'll soon have reading in Chronicles and also in Numbers, and they're actually two books doing sort of the same things. Thank you very much. I hope this is of help.